Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Mess. So, Tarek, and I'm here to talk about the 2026 bingo card, that metaphorical bingo card that we all have with different events that could happen in the year, some of them very likely and some of them completely unlikely. And honestly, the video we're going to be talking about today, this is like getting a bingo on a blackout card, having to get every single spot, including some of the rarest and hardest to get out there. That is because there is not one but two experimental PlayStation 5 emulators available that you can play around with today. And I had heard some rumblings about a month ago that this might be happening, and I'm pretty sure timing-wise because Sony just announced they're no longer making PlayStation 5 and then 6 physical media in the beginning of 2028. I feel like this launch is definitely something that was timed to coincide with that actual announcement. And even if this is extremely early, it's basically how every single emulator gets its start, as a proof of concept loading up a few very simple 2D games, and then suddenly 3, 5, 8 years down the line, you're sitting on your gaming chair playing PlayStation 5, but via emulation and not real hardware. And that, again, is something that is absolutely probably not on your 2026 bingo card of things that you thought would happen. But this is definitely a very good thing, at least in my opinion, outside of the little bit of wiggliness of having it actually exist while the PlayStation 5 is still on retail store shelves. It's not like you're going to be sitting down and playing games on this right now, at least not at frame rates you would ever want to experience, and no 3D whatsoever. But because PlayStation is removing that physical media from us, this is definitely going to be going towards preservation in the future. Because I will always say, video game emulation is preservation, and the more emulation the better to keep these games alive, especially now that Sony decides that you don't actually have to have a copy of a game to own it. You could just pay them for a license, and hey, maybe one day they will take it away. But this news basically came out over the weekend. I waited until Monday to actually take a look at it via video form. I did some research, talked to a few people, and kind of went through some of the source code to better understand exactly what was going on. And I will say it definitely is a PlayStation 5 emulator. It will load up a few games, and no, I am not going to teach you how to do this today. That is because I'm being a little bit careful around this subject because, again, the PlayStation 5 is still a system that you can walk into a store and purchase off the shelf today. Is it interesting enough, and was the generation fun enough to actually justify the new price, especially for a PlayStation 5 Pro? I would definitely say not, but it is something that is still on sale, and that's something I usually avoid on the channel when I can. But because this is news-based and it is emulation-based, it was definitely something that I always had to cover. And there, again, is a lot of information out there. We're going to be going over all of it. And I will definitely update this video as time goes on with new innovations and new improvements in PlayStation 5 emulation. And I did test this a little bit in the background. It was quite an interesting experience. But right now, what is running is going to be basically almost purely 2D, and it isn't going to be running at any sort of frame rate that you would consider playable. And we kind of have to even talk about the air quotes emulation of PlayStation 5 or even PlayStation 4. And that is because, as far as the architecture is concerned, it's very similar to a modern PC and not to an actual game console. Because when we talk about emulation on the channel, what we really usually mean by the capital E emulation is your modern system, your modern CPU, and in some instances the GPU actually transposing calls and pretending to be hardware they are not. Something like Namco System 21 hardware here, that's going to be silicon that does not exist in your system and basically has to be 100% purely emulated so that your CPU can pretend to be the CPU and all the other hardware inside that board. Whereas recently we talked about Silent Scope Bone Eater, a finally playable game in Techno Parrot. Now this is using the same hardware or very similar specs to what you would find in your PC, so it is quote-unquote emulation. It's closer to a translation layer to be able to assign all those calls over to the hardware and operating system you are using. So that is something when we talk about PlayStation 5 emulation and even PlayStation 4 emulation, it's not the same concept as when you're emulating Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis, when you're dealing with basically assembly language and hardware that has absolutely nothing to do with what's in your PC. Because honestly, a PlayStation 4 and a PlayStation 5 are just underpowered PCs at this point in time. That AMD APU, something that you can basically get off the shelf at least for PlayStation 4 and 5 on different cards and kind of play around with. So that's just something that I want you to kind of keep in the back of your head, that this emulation is different than what you would expect, even if you're talking about Saturn, PlayStation 1, or Dreamcast. But honestly, it all falls under the emulation umbrella, so it does make sense to use that word. I just wanted to be clear that it's doing the exact same thing in a completely different way, so you kind of understand a little bit more about that. Now, taking a look here from one of the devs, this is something that they've been working on for over a year. It is open source, and you can pop over to the GitHub and go ahead and go through all the different code, grab yourself a build, and try to test it. Again, you're going to be completely on your own on that one. I don't plan on doing any tutorials as far as teaching you how to do this. But if we take a look here, you'll see that it is showing screenshots, and of course it is getting into games. But like I said, don't expect a ton right now. It is not going to be running at full speed. You're going to have a pretty high test CPU and GPU to be able to do this. So the first of the two emulators that are available to test is going to be SharpEmu. Not sure why it stands for Sharp, what that means, just the name that they've chosen, so that is what it is. And you're going to see that it is just targeting Windows, and it is extremely preliminary. I don't want you to think that you're going to sit down and play any PlayStation 5 games from start to finish on PlayStation 5 emulation right now. This is purely experimental. It purely is a vibe just to see what could happen in the future. And basically every other system we've ever had out there has gotten an emulator at a certain point in time. So maybe it'll take 24 months, maybe it'll take 5 years, maybe it'll take 10 years. But I can basically guarantee you at some point in time you're going to be emulating PlayStation 5 games the same way you emulate PlayStation 3 and even some PlayStation 4 games at this point in time. Now going over some test footage, this is from a channel, Brutal Sam, that one of the Discord members on my server sent to me, and I always believe a rising tide floats all boats, so it's one of those things. They have a much smaller viewer base and subscriber base than I do, so the link to their channel is down below. I've just taken a couple of clips, go over there, blow them up with subs, leave comments saying VGE sent me, and give them your support, because it's one of those things. I love to see other channels succeed, and you will see that it can get into some 2D games, and that really isn't all that weird because it doesn't use as many calls to the hardware, and basically every other emulator we've ever seen in development always loads up a 2D game first. At this point in time, it's kind of part and parcel, par for the course when it comes to how to do this stuff. If we go over all of the different things that do and don't work in Sharp PS5 Emu here, you're going to see it can load the eboot.bin and elf files, or basically the executables, because .elf is an executable just on a different operating system. It can load up game files, it can get into some games and output the video for them. It is rudimentary, but it is highly impressive, and I do love to see stuff like this, and I got so many different messages of people asking me to talk about it. I knew I had to. And honestly, it's very interesting to see the original first days of a new emulator, because this is basically how everything gets its start. It barely does anything, it barely runs, but you can see some signs of life in the actual code execution, displaying graphics and even audio, and that's something that is impressive that it works that well off basically what amounts to the first couple days of its actual life out on the internet. Now, of course, it's one of those things the developer said he spent a year on this, at least on the Sharp side of things, and then we have another one. Maybe it's KyTy PS5, maybe it's KyTy. Not quite sure on that. They don't have a pronunciation, so you leave me a comment down below and you tell me. This seems to be maybe a fork of the actual Sharp, but it's hard to tell exactly what's going on here. But now there's not one, but two PlayStation 5 emulators that you can test. And again, if you had more than one PlayStation 5 emulator on your 2026 bingo card, then you must have been a prognosticator to Nostradamus standards, because I never would have guessed we would have seen one unless I knew about it in advance, and I definitely didn't expect to see two going on either. So it's definitely impressive that happened all at once, and it really does feel kind of planned again. Now moving back to another clip from Brutal Sam's channel, and again he tested maybe like 10 or 11 games, seeing different results. Cult of the Lamb is drawing graphics, but of course the frame rate is way slower than it would be on real hardware. But a lot of times that's just because it is very early in its code base, and when the code is refined and cleaned up, you get speed efficiencies. So it's not like this is going to be something that you need to wait 3 years for a CPU and GPU to exist to be able to run it in full speed. You're probably going to have to wait that same amount of time for the developers to actually go in and rework the code to make sure it's just running faster. Because the first goal is not to get it running at full speed. The first goal is to get anything running in any way, shape, or form. And the fact that they've even gotten that far in a year is hyper impressive. Because trust me, PlayStation 5 preservation is going to be emulation, especially when Sony stops producing the discs for it. And as far as PlayStation 6 being a completely digital console, it's going to be one of those things. Once the store is shut down, once the consoles are broken, you're going to have to depend on emulation to be able to actually play the large, vast library that I'm sure that system will get. And that's why so many people, myself very much included, were upset when we heard that Sony was abandoning physical media for the PlayStation 5 in the future, and definitely for the PlayStation 6. because we know full well how easy it is for games to get lost to time, and if it wasn't for emulation, thousands upon thousands of games would already be lost out there. So this is not only important because it is a very big technical achievement, it's also important because it's going to aid in preservation in the future, because honestly, video games are kind of treating themselves like some of the earliest films when film was actually an art form. They were never preserved, so many are lost to time, and basically the beginning history of the medium of film is lost out there. And even though we've had video games for some time now, it is still a very young medium of art compared to everything else, so it definitely deserves fan preservation, and that's exactly what this is. So if you've tested either one of these, leave me your thoughts down below. I would be curious, but we're done. I'll definitely keep up on this topic as things change, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.